American gas prices crossed $4 per gallon on March 31, 2026. The IEA called what caused it the greatest global energy security challenge in history. And this week, Donald Trump flew to Beijing to meet the one man on earth who might be able to fix it. Xi Jinping is Iran's biggest customer. He buys more Iranian oil than any other country on earth. And nearly all of Iran's crude oil exports go directly to China. That is the switch. Xi Jinping holds it. And your gas price depends on whether he decides to turn it. Here is everything that happened, how we got here, and what it means for the person filling up their tank this weekend. Most Americans have never thought about the Strait of Hormuz. It is a narrow strip of water between Iran and Oman, roughly 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It does not sound like something that should affect the price of gas in Ohio. And yet, the Strait of Hormuz is the single most important oil chokepoint on Earth. Before the war, roughly 20% of the world's entire oil supply passed through it every single day. 27% of all maritime crude oil and petroleum products globally moved through that narrow channel, according to the Congressional Research Service. Roughly 21 million barrels per day. Every day. When that channel closes or even partially closes, the entire global oil market reacts. Not because America imports most of its oil from the Gulf. The US is actually a significant domestic producer. But because oil is a global commodity priced on global markets. When supply anywhere drops, prices everywhere rise. You cannot separate American gas prices from global oil prices. They are the same thing. The war between the United States, Israel, and Iran began on February 28, 2026. Within days, everything changed. On March 2nd, an official from Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps stated publicly, "The strait is closed. If anyone tries to pass, the heroes of the Revolutionary Guards and the regular Navy will set those ships ablaze." They meant it. Brent crude, the international oil benchmark, surged 10 to 13% to around $80 to $82 per barrel within the first 2 days of the conflict. By April 6th, the U.S. benchmark West Texas Intermediate had climbed to $115.48 per barrel. By the time CBS News reported on the 8-week economic impact of the war, Brent crude was trading at $105 a barrel, up 44% since before the war started. Gas prices in the United States, which had been around $3 per gallon before the conflict, crossed $4 per gallon on March 31st. That was the first time prices had been at that level since 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and sent energy markets into chaos. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, the body that monitors global energy security, did not mince words. Its head described the Strait of Hormuz situation as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not the largest in recent history, the largest ever in recorded history. Trump's response came in several waves. On March 18th, he ordered the Department of Energy to release 172 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, a significant drawdown that would take approximately 120 days to deliver. He waived the Jones Act for 60 days, allowing foreign-flagged vessels to ship goods between American ports. He allowed the sale of higher ethanol gasoline blends, normally prohibited in summer due to smog concerns. He also launched what the White House called Project Freedom, an effort to guide stranded commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz under U.S. military escort. By late Tuesday of the first week of the operation, according to NBC News, only 2 commercial vessels had been guided safely through. Both had U.S. military security teams aboard. Iran had launched attacks on both of them during the crossing. Thousands of ships remained stranded, unable to transit the strait. Trump abruptly ended Project Freedom, citing great progress in peace talks. The same day, NBC News reported, just 1 ship crossed the strait. The next day none crossed it. Normal traffic before the war, hundreds of ships per day. During the crisis, 0. That is the gap between what was and what is. And that gap is what you are paying for at the pump. It is worth pausing here to explain something that most gas price coverage skips over. Why does a war in a country that the United States doesn't primarily import oil from affect what Americans pay at the pump? The answer is that oil is a global commodity traded on global markets. The price of a barrel of crude oil is set by supply and demand across the entire planet, not just in any one country. When 20% of the global supply is suddenly restricted or cut off, The global price of oil rises. When the global price rises, every country that refines oil into gasoline pays more for the raw material, including the United States. The CEPR, the Center for Economic Policy Research, published a detailed model of the inflationary impact in late April 2026. Their analysis is worth understanding because it gives you the specific numbers. Under what they described as a cautiously optimistic scenario, 1 quarter of straight closure, followed by a gradual recovery. The surge in oil prices would raise U.S. headline inflation by 0.6 percentage points in 2026. Core inflation, the measure that excludes food and energy, would rise by 0.2 percentage points. If the closure lasted 3 quarters, U.S. headline inflation would rise by 1.1 percentage points, and core inflation by 0.3 percentage points. Those numbers sound small. They are not small. The Federal Reserve has a 2% inflation target. The Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index was already at 2.8% annually in February 2026, before the war. Scott Lincecum, Vice President of General Economics at the Cato Institute, told CBS News that the PCE could hit 4% by the end of 2026, double the Fed's target. The EIA, the Energy Information Administration, published projections showing that the war could push retail gas prices approximately 60 to 70 cents per gallon higher in the second quarter of 2026, compared to what they would otherwise have been. Every 10 cents rise in gas prices adds roughly $15 billion annually to U.S. consumer costs. A 70 cents rise means American consumers are paying approximately $105 billion more per year on gasoline alone. That is before accounting for the second-order effects. Higher diesel prices mean every product transported by truck costs more to deliver. Every Amazon package, every grocery delivery, every restaurant supply, every piece of construction material. The Food Policy Institute warned of long-term increases in food prices due to disruption in fuel and fertilizer markets, because fertilizer production also depends on energy inputs, and on the LNG that was also being blocked in the Gulf. Lydia Boussour, a senior economist at EY Parthenon, cited lingering impacts on supply chains and energy capacity, and said, "Our view is that full normalization will still take time." Jeremy Siegel, senior economist at global asset manager WisdomTree, was more direct about why this matters psychologically, as much as economically. He wrote in March that gasoline is the most visible price in the economy for consumers, and when that price jumps, it hits psychology immediately. It does. Gas station prices are the one price that Americans see every single day, displayed in giant illuminated numbers on the side of roads across the country. They are a daily visible reminder of how the economy feels, and how the economy feels in an election year. Midterms are coming is not a small consideration for any administration. Trump had campaigned on affordability. He had promised, repeatedly, to drill more and lower prices. The war had upended all of that. And as analysts at GasBuddy noted in late March, prices had nowhere to go but up. Here is where China enters the story. Iran and China have one of the most consequential economic relationships in the current global order, and it is built almost entirely on oil. China is the world's largest crude oil importer. In 2024, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, approximately 10% of China's oil imports came directly from Iran. More than half of China's total oil imports came from the Middle East broadly. And on the other side of that trade, nearly all of Iran's crude oil exports go to China. That last sentence is the critical one. Iran's oil sector has been under American sanctions for years. Most Western countries and companies are prohibited from buying Iranian oil. China has continued buying it, providing Iran with a critical economic lifeline that has sustained the Iranian government through years of international isolation. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, speaking from Beijing on CNBC on May 14, described China's position with unusual directness. China has a much bigger interest in reopening the strait than the U.S. does. Bessent said, "Nearly all of Iran's crude oil exports go to China." He added, "It's very much in their interest to get the strait reopened. I think they will be working behind the scenes, to the extent anyone has any say over the Iranian leadership." That phrase, "to the extent anyone has any say," is the important qualifier. It acknowledges what analysts have noted for months, that China's influence over Iran is real but not unlimited. Iran considers itself an independent regional power. It does not take orders from Beijing, but it does depend on Beijing's continued willingness to buy its oil, to provide economic support, and to shield it from the worst effects of international sanctions. At the UN Security Council, that dependency is leverage, not a direct switch that Xi Jinping can flip to immediately reopen the strait, but a relationship that, if China chose to apply it, could create significant pressure on Tehran. The question, as analysts at Al Jazeera noted, is what China would want in return for applying that pressure. Professor Inderjeet Palmer of City, University of London, put it plainly to Al Jazeera. Trump needs Chinese support for opening the Strait of Hormuz. China needs the Strait of Hormuz to open for its own reasons, of oil and energy from Iran and so on. At the same time, they can use this as leverage regarding Taiwan. An analyst at Bowdoin College, Christopher Herlin, offered a different framing. He told Al Jazeera that Iran is not really the central issue for either party in the summit. Both sides have broader agendas. The Iran angle is one item on a very long list. And The Economist, in a front cover from last month, framed the dynamic between Trump and Xi Jinping, with a quote attributed to Napoleon Bonaparte: "Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake." There are multiple ways to read China's position: that it genuinely wants the strait open, because Chinese vessels need it too; that it is willing to apply quiet pressure on Tehran, as part of a broader diplomatic accommodation with Washington; that it will extract Xi Jinping concessions on Taiwan, on trade, on rare earths, before doing anything substantive; that it has less influence over Iran than Washington believes. All of these perspectives come from credentialed analysts. The audience will need to weigh them. What is documented is China's behavior during the summit itself. Donald Trump met Xi Jinping at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing on May 14th and 15th, 2026. The meeting produced a specific set of documented outcomes on the Iran and Hormuz question, and a set of notable ambiguities around them. The documented outcomes, starting with the White House's own readout. The two sides agreed, according to the White House, that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to support the free flow of energy. The readout continued. President Xi Jinping also made clear China's opposition to the militarization of the strait and any effort to charge a toll for its use. Iran had been reportedly seeking to implement a toll system for ships crossing Hormuz, effectively charging passage fees for the route it was blockading. Xi Jinping's opposition to that system, if communicated to Tehran, would be a meaningful signal. Trump, speaking to Fox News after the summit, said Xi Jinping had offered to help. He said, "I would love to be a help if I can be of any help whatsoever." Trump told Fox News. He added that Xi Jinping had assured him China would not provide military equipment to Iran. He said he's not going to give military equipment, Trump said. That's a big statement. Trump also said Xi Jinping told him that China intended to continue buying oil from Iran, even as Beijing opposed Iran's efforts to militarize or toll the strait. He said, "You know, they buy a lot of their oil there, and they'd like to keep doing that," Trump said. The White House readout added that President Xi Jinping also expressed interest in purchasing more American oil to reduce China's dependence on the strait in the future. Though Chinese state media did not confirm those discussions publicly, Euronews reported that Chinese vessels had begun passing through the strait, following what Iranian state-run media described as an understanding over Iranian management protocols for the passage. The significance of that development, whether it represented a genuine easing of restrictions or a narrow exception for Chinese-flagged vessels, was not immediately clear at time of reporting. Treasury Secretary Besant, from Beijing, said he believed China will be working behind the scenes with Iranian leadership. Chinese state media's account of the Xi Jinping-Trump meeting mentioned only that the leaders exchanged views on major international and regional issues, such as the Middle East situation. It did not mention Hormuz specifically. That gap between what the White House said was agreed and what Chinese state media confirmed is worth noting. The Euronews account described the summit as having made some progress on Iran without delivering any major economic breakthroughs. The primary economic focus, Euronews reported, was on agriculture, aviation, and artificial intelligence sectors. The broader goal of the summit was described as stabilizing the relationship between the US and China and maintaining a fragile truce on trade. On Taiwan, Xi Jinping warned Trump directly according to Times account. that the island remained the most dangerous flashpoint in the relationship, and that disputes over it could push Washington and Beijing toward direct confrontation if mishandled. Xi Jinping said, "The US must handle the Taiwan issue with utmost caution." Al Jazeera's analysts had predicted exactly this dynamic before the summit, that China would use the Hormuz situation as leverage on Taiwan. The summit appears to have played out consistent with that prediction, with Xi Jinping offering help on Hormuz, while simultaneously issuing a direct warning on Taiwan, leaving it to Washington to interpret the connection. So what does all of this mean for the person filling their tank? There are 3 documented scenarios, based on the current state of play as of May 15, 2026. The first scenario is that China's behind-the-scenes pressure works. In this scenario, Beijing quietly communicates to Tehran that continued Chinese economic support, continued oil purchases, continued sanctions shielding, depends on Iran allowing normal commercial traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, which depends on that support for its economic survival, agrees to restore normal passage. Global oil supply recovers. Brent crude, which has been trading at $105 per barrel, falls back toward pre-war levels of approximately $70 to $75 per barrel. The EIA's own projections suggested that retail gas prices, which it had forecast could be 60 to 70 cents per gallon higher through the second quarter, would fall back toward $3 per gallon by end of 2026, if disruptions ended. Earlier in the crisis, NBC News reported that when news broke of a potential US-Iran deal, US crude oil plunged 15% to $88 per barrel, and Brent crude fell 11% to $96 per barrel in a single trading session. The stock market surged. The Dow jumped more than 610 points. That single data point tells you how much of current gas prices is conflict premium, and how fast it could come down if the conflict premium disappears. The second scenario is that China's influence proves limited, or that China extracts concessions on Taiwan that Washington is unwilling to pay. In this scenario, Xi Jinping's offer to be a help remains diplomatic language, without operational follow-through. Iran continues restricting traffic. China continues buying Iranian oil. The strait remains partially closed. Global oil prices remain elevated. CEPR's modeling shows that a 3-quarter closure would push U.S. headline inflation up by 1.1 percentage points for the full year. Combined with the E11 Jinping tariff-driven inflation, that puts the Federal Reserve in an impossible position. Raise rates to fight inflation and risk recession, or hold rates and watch purchasing power erode. CBS News quoted Scott Lincicome saying, "Consumers should expect things to remain higher than what people want." He noted that 70 cents of every dollar of U.S. GDP comes from consumer spending, meaning that if consumers pull back because of high energy costs, GDP growth slows. Consumers, of course, want deflation, and we're definitely not getting that, he said. The third scenario, which is less discussed in Western media but present in the analysis, is that the current situation produces a partial, slow normalization. That keeps gas prices elevated but below peak, with uncertainty dragging on through the remainder of 2026. In this scenario, the strait reopens partially but remains a risk zone. Shipping insurance premiums, which had risen to 4 or 5 times pre-war levels, according to Congress.gov, remain elevated because insurers cannot trust the security of the passage. Fewer ships transit than before. Oil supply recovers partially but not fully. Gas prices settle somewhere between $3 and $4 per gallon, with the exact number depending on weekly news from the Gulf. This is the scenario most consistent with what the data shows as of this recording. A ceasefire formally in place since April 8th. But ship traffic through the strait, remaining far below pre-war levels, according to the IEA's characterization, and ongoing concerns about energy security as of late April 2026. Before the close, it is worth stepping back from the American gas station to look at the global picture, because the people most severely affected by the Strait of Hormuz crisis are not Americans. The U.S. is a significant domestic oil producer. It is buffered, relative to other countries, from the worst effects of a Gulf supply disruption. The economic impact of the Iran war on the U.S., while real and significant, is orders of magnitude less severe than what other countries are experiencing. India, the world's 4th largest oil refiner, began buying petroleum from Russia as Middle Eastern supply dried up. The Indian government raised export duties on diesel and aviation fuel. LPG, the main cooking fuel for hundreds of millions of Indian households, was the first product to be affected. Long queues formed at gas stations. People turned to kerosene, coal, and wood as stopgap measures. Myanmar restricted private vehicle use to alternate days due to fuel shortages. Nepal began refilling consumers' empty cylinders only halfway to stretch stockpiles. Qatar's Ras Laffan Industrial Complex, one of the world's largest LNG facilities, was hit by an Iranian strike in March, causing a 17% reduction in Qatar's LNG production capacity. Analysts estimated the damage would require 3 to 5 years to fully repair. LNG spot prices in Asia increased by over 140%. The 2026 Iran war fuel crisis documentation notes that panic buying and severe disruption to the distribution of petroleum products, liquefied natural gas, and urea used for fertilizer have affected much of the world. Urea derived from natural gas is a primary ingredient in agricultural fertilizer. Its shortage does not just mean higher fuel prices. It means lower crop yields and higher food prices. In countries that are already food insecure, this is the full chain of consequences. From a 33-kilometer strait being partially closed in the Gulf, and the country that has more influence than any other over whether that strait reopens is not the United States, which has launched military operations, released strategic reserves, waived the Jones Act, and sent Navy escorts. It is China, which has done none of those things, continues to buy Iranian oil, and sat across the table from Donald Trump in Beijing this week, with an offer to be of any help whatsoever. What that help costs, what it delivers, and whether it is enough, that remains, as of this recording, unanswered. Here is what we know. The Strait of Hormuz has been partially closed since early March 2026. The IEA has called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. American gas prices crossed $4 per gallon on March 31st and have remained elevated since. Brent crude peaked above $105 per barrel. The Iran war has added an estimated 0.6 to 1.1 percentage points to U.S. inflation, depending on how long the disruption lasts. China is Iran's largest oil customer. Nearly all of Iran's crude exports go to China. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said from Beijing this week that China has a much bigger interest in reopening the strait than the U.S. does. The White House says both leaders agreed the strait must remain open. Chinese state media confirmed only that they discussed the Middle East situation. Trump said Xi Jinping offered to help. Xi Jinping warned Trump about Taiwan. Chinese vessels began passing through the strait, following what Iranian media described as a new management protocol. Thousands of ships remained stranded. Trump left Beijing saying he had made fantastic trade deals. He did not elaborate. Gas prices, as of this recording, remain above $4 per gallon. The CEPR's economists say that if the strait disruption ends within 1 quarter, prices should fall back toward pre-war levels by end of year. If it lasts longer, inflation stays elevated through 2026 and potentially beyond. Whether Xi Jinping's behind-the-scenes influence on Tehran proves real, whether the price of that influence, whatever it is, proves acceptable to Washington, and whether Iran's leadership ultimately decides that the cost of continued closure outweighs the strategic benefits. None of that is settled. What is settled is this. The price of gas at the pump in every American city right now is connected by a chain of documented events to a narrow strip of water 12,000 kilometers away, and to a conversation that just happened in Beijing between the two most powerful men in the world, what they actually agreed to, and what it will cost in the weeks ahead. The audience is watching in real time. Sources: CBS News, April 2026, Time Magazine, March and May 2026, NBC News, May 2026, CNBC Bessent interview, May 14, 2026, Al Jazeera, May 13, 2026, Euronews, May 15, 2026, Congressional Research Service Congress.gov, March 2026, CEPR Vox EU, April 2026, Wikipedia 2026 Iran War Fuel Crisis and Economic Impact Pages, New York Fed Liberty Street Economics, February 2026, Brookings Institution, March 2026, Wisdom Trio Jeremy Ziegel, March 2026, Cato Institute, Scott Lincecum via CBS News, EY Parthenon Lydia Bussour via CBS News.